The following views are not necessarily endorsed by this radio station.
We're speaking with Michelle Pearce, CEO of the Australian Christian Lobby. Firstly, Michelle, what is the Australian Christian Lobby?
It's a political lobby group. We lobby politicians on issues that Christians are concerned about across the nation. We have influence on public policy, and also we educate Christians around the nation as to what the key issues are and enable them to campaign alongside us.
Now, you've created a website, australiavotes.org.au. How should people use it?
australiavotes.org.au is a website where we have compared all of the policies of the major parties on issues of concern to Christians, and also allowed candidates to respond to a question that we've put to them so Christians can compare the positions of the parties and also see the values of their candidates.
How have you chosen the policy questions addressed on the website?
There are a broad range of issues that Christians are concerned about. We couldn't ask parties 100 questions, so we had to condense it to those that we really believe are pertinent to our nation at this very moment. So I think that Christians who come from many different perspectives will be able to appreciate the answers that are given on the website.
And finally, Michelle, what would be your encouragement to Christians as the election draws closer?
Go onto the website australiavotes.org.au and be informed. If all Christians are well informed and if we all vote according to truth, then we can have a significant impact on the outcome of the election.
Authorised by M. Pearce for the Australian Christian Lobby Canberra, station sponsor.
Hope you're ready for some straight talk today. It's great to have your company here on the Towards Understanding podcast. We are going to be encouraged, inspired, and challenged today, especially if you're somebody who has a faith in Jesus. Now, if you don't have that faith in Jesus, don't worry. This is a great podcast for you to listen to, but we are going to be framing it from the perspective of how do we talk about Jesus in a world that maybe doesn't want to hear much about Jesus, but do it without being full of ourselves, without looking like an idiot. And in fact, that is literally the title of Andy's book, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. He's got a passion and a heart to have real conversations, but actually really be curious about somebody else before you even talk about something that you might believe in. Looking forward to bringing this interview to you. Just before we get into it, if you like this podcast, would you rate, review, share it with others, follow it? It's free, always will be, and we just want to get it out to as many people, and those things help us do that. All right, let's get stuck into this conversation with Dr. Andy Bannister. G'day, Andy.
Good day, Clayton. Great to be joining you from the other side of the globe. Always enjoy talking to folks down in the great nation of Australia. So thanks for having me on the show.
It's so good to have you here. You're also the Director of Solas, I think is how we say that. So explain to us what that is as well.
Yes, you got the pronunciation pretty much right. So Solas is the Gaelic word for light, because originally we were a Scottish organisation. We now cover the UK. So really what we are, Clayton, we're a small organisation, team of 8 of us, and focusing on a couple of things. First thing is really getting the message of Jesus and the Christian faith out of the four walls of the churches and into the public square. So we put on events in cafes and pubs, restaurants, schools, workplaces, universities, really wanting to get people to engage with Christian faith and the claims of Jesus. We love it engaging with people's questions and doubts and all that kind of stuff. So that's a huge amount of what we do. And then the other half of what we do is doing stuff within the Christian community, in churches and Christian groups, really trying to help Christians just get a bit more equipped and a bit more able to talk to their friends, their mates, their colleagues, their family about the things they believe in a normal kind of way. Because often Christians get tongue-tied, don't know where to start, use a bit of Christianese, all that kind of stuff. And if we can help people overcome that, what we're finding, I think, is lots of our friends are open to conversations about faith, especially when Christians do that in a winsome and friendly and accessible way.
Why do you think there's perhaps a need for this? My perhaps assessment of it is that over the past 50, 60, 70 years, maybe some of, especially the more Protestant understandings of the Christian faith have become a little bit more, it's very black and white descriptions and how we're going to say things, and we're in or we're out. And maybe we're now trying to realise, well, that doesn't actually necessarily build the best relationships the whole time. Am I a bit off base there? Am I perhaps being a bit harsh on some of the broader understandings?
No, I think you're pretty much in the ballpark, and I think that one of the reasons for it, there's many reasons for it, but I think one of the reasons, Clayton, is as countries have secularized. So Australia, like Europe, like North America, have been on a journey sort of through secularization. Arguably, that's bottoming out. Actually, people are beginning to explore faith again. But what that's caused sometimes to happen is Christians, we've circled the wagons. We felt a bit under threat. The culture's changed. We don't know what to do, so we get defensive and we start talking to ourselves at that point. And I think that's where the problem starts. Back in an age where the majority of perhaps Australia went to church, and even if your next door neighbour didn't really believe, you had a common language with them, so you could leap straight in to sort of using Christian language, and they would at least know what you meant. Now the chances are that your colleague at work, your classmate, the person you play sport with, doesn't have a Christian background. So if you start leaping in using Christian language, they've got no idea what you're talking about. So I think that's where it's come from. It's come from the culture's changed. We're a bit uncertain. We haven't caught up. And as I say, the temptation then just to talk to ourselves, which is such a shame because, as I say, I think we've hit peak secular, and particularly among young people, we're seeing such a resurgent interest in faith again. So there's an amazing opportunity for Christians. We just need to think through, or perhaps rediscover ways that we used in the past for engaging with those outside the church as we talk about Jesus and why he's important.
There's so many parts of your world and your study that we do want to look into and chat to today. Let's start with this idea of this book, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, which I think is perhaps arguably one of the most gripping titles that I've seen of a book. It certainly doesn't leave much to the imagination of what the book's going to be about, which I love. Let's talk about that with the knowledge and the full understanding that we know that a lot of people who are listening to this program right now would say, well, I do have a Christian faith and I do want to talk about Jesus with my friends. And there's others might be saying, well, I know that this is a Christian radio station, but I'm not really connecting in with that faith as yet, but I'm happy to hear a bit more about it. What are some of the things that, whether we're sort of coming from that faith perspective or perhaps we're a bit interested in that we should be talking about Jesus?
Well, the big idea behind that book, and I'm really grateful that you like the title. In a sense, I wrote the book, Clayton, that I wish I could have had when I was in my 20s, because my first job, I worked for the local health board here in the UK, so I worked in a hospital, doing sort of just administration there. And although I was a Christian and active in my church inside work, I was just useless. I was literally an undercover Christian when I went into work. I didn't talk about my faith. I just didn't know where to begin. So in a sense, I wrote the book that I wish someone had put in my hot little hands when I was like 23. But the heart of the book, and what's interesting, that for both types of listener on your show, whether you're a Christian or you're just intrigued by faith and kind of hanging around the fringes, the heart of the book is teaching people the importance of asking good questions. And where that comes from, by the way, that comes from Jesus. If you go and read the Gospels, those 4 eyewitness historical accounts we have of Jesus in the New Testament, what strikes you is he was a man who loved questions. 307 questions Jesus asked. And I think questions are a really powerful way to start conversations about faith or dig into deep things. So rather than as a Christian leaping with your size 10s and walking up to your friend and going, you should believe in Jesus, what about by starting with questions like, well, what do you believe? And what do you think about, life, the universe and everything? What do you think the point of life is? There's all kinds of questions you can start with to gently warm people up to begin bringing Jesus into the conversation. And on the other side, if you're listening to this, you don't have a faith, be willing to ask yourself some tough questions. If you would say, well, I'm not sure I believe. Well, okay, why don't you believe is a good question to ask. What's holding you back? What's the stumbling block? What's the objection? What's the thing about Christian faith that doesn't make sense to you? If you had the opportunity to ask God one question, what would it be? And so I think questions are a great way to start. They level the playing field, they get a conversation started, and that you dig into what people really think rather than flinging sound bites at each other.
Love that. Questions are so important and show so much of an interest in the other person as well. I think it's a big part of what it is, that this is not just about convincing somebody, but it's actually about truly caring for somebody and having a relationship. That certainly is about questions as well. Can I ask something else around, which I know you do touch off in the book too, which is around this idea of why do those who have a Christian faith feel perhaps a bit afraid or uncomfortable about sharing that? I know certainly for me in the past, that's been a little bit about, well, I don't want to shove something down someone's throat that they might not want or whatever, and I feel a bit uncomfortable about how to bring that up or what it is. But in your understanding, why do people feel a bit afraid to talk about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Clayton. And as you say, I've got a whole chapter in the book looking at fear, and I think it's a number of things, right? I think firstly, I think Australia, like the UK, we're fairly sort of happy-go-lucky cultures, and we don't want to be thought of as forcing our views down somebody's throat, right? That doesn't sort of play well in your country as in mine. First thing. So I think Christians, we can sometimes struggle to navigate that a bit, which, by the way, is why questions are great, because conversations are great. You're a culture that loves talking. We're a culture that loves talking. So rather than frame it in terms of shoving my view, what about framing it in terms of how can I have a really good conversation with my friend about the things I care deeply about, in this case, Jesus? And by the way, having that in an open way such that if there are things they care about or views they hold different to mine, that comes into the conversation. But that's a big part of it. Secondly, I think, we are told all the time through the media that we live in this very secular culture that only rational people believe in it, only irrational people believe in faith. If you're rational and 21st century and modern and progressive, then you'll be an atheist. I think Christians have imbibed that lie from the media. And by the way, it is a lie because there are some brilliant men and women who are people of faith. The majority of the world are religious, not irreligious. It's only the West that has a slight blip, and even that's changing. So I think that's one of the causes of fear. The third thing, I'll do two more. The third, I think as well, we want to be liked, right? There's a generally, natural human instinct to want people to like us, and therefore that can tempt us to always take the easy route. And that applies to topics other than just religion, by the way. Sometimes we can be tempted to keep our political views to ourselves, depending on the circles you're in. You keep quiet about the sports team that you support if you're in a room full of people who don't. And I think there's that very natural human tendency. And I think, as Christians, we need to work through that a little bit. And then fourthly, I would say, I think to really reflect on what the gospel, the message of Jesus really is, because it's not just life transforming, it's the greatest news in the universe. And if you had, if you discovered the cure for cancer, say, and but you were afraid to tell people because you might embarrass somebody afterwards, your mates who that might transform their life would probably quite rightly say to you, hang on, you were sitting on this amazing piece of information that could have saved the lives of tens of thousands of people, and you kept quiet because you were afraid of being embarrassed. So as Christians, I think we should reflect, on the power of the story of Jesus. If Jesus' claims are true, if Christianity is true, it is the most important news in the universe, and we are selfish not to share it. If, on the other hand, it isn't true, it's utterly irrelevant, and why would you bother anybody? But if you believe that it's true, it's too good news to sit on and keep quiet about.
That final point reminds me of someone who is very much an atheist in Penn Jillette, who is the one half of Penn and Teller, the famous magicians. And he is an atheist, definitely, but he tells the story of, hey, look, if you are a Christian, you truly believe this. He uses the story of, if I'm standing there and you can see a bus about to hit me and you don't run out to try and help me with that bus, I don't think you really care about me. So he's like, I always want Christians to come up and talk to me about it and try and share with me what that is, because if this is truly what that is, then of course that's what you should be doing. I think that's
that's right. And by the way, just an aside, I'm glad you mentioned. I nearly mentioned Penn, so I'm glad you did. If the listeners haven't seen that, if you dig me up on social media, I'm pretty easy to find. Andy G. Bannister on most social media channels. Just before Christmas, I posted that video clip where Penn Jillette, that very famous atheist, did that little monologue. And it's amazing. Yeah, he basically says, I don't respect Christians who don't evangelize. I don't respect you. I can disagree with you if you evangelize, but I don't respect you if you don't. Because if you claim this news is so vital that I as an atheist need to hear it and you keep it to yourself, then I doubt you believe it. Yeah. So an amazingly powerful motivational speech on sharing your faith from a hardcore atheist. Yeah, and it's one that I reposted it on social media just before Christmas.
Some of the tough questions I think is also part of what it might be. I know certainly that, as I've ever had conversations with people, often the idea of suffering comes up. It does seem to be that big one, right? And I don't think any of us have a perfect answer to why there's suffering in the world that certainly fulfills and helps all the emotional parts of what there is. There's, I think, perhaps practical and biblical and theological answers to that, but it does seem to be a big one. Obviously, that's one that lots of people end up coming to. How do you tend to talk about that and have discussion when you're having chats with people when the issue of suffering in this world and why God doesn't just sort of click his fingers and stop that happening?
That's a great question, Clayton. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that, of course, fear perhaps of being asked those questions can sometimes hold Christians back from talking about our faith. But to use the question asking approach, if I'm talking to a friend or someone I've met who raises the issue of suffering, as you say, it comes up a lot. I firstly want to begin with some questions. One of the first things I want to explore is why they're asking that question. Are they just being academic and, sort of throwing out a philosophical question, if God exists, why is there suffering? If it's just operating that level, that's fine, but we can deal with it one way. On the other hand, if they've experienced suffering personally, if there's something going on in their life, then perhaps I want to start in a more kind of, sort of pastoral, almost sort of compassionate end of the spectrum. So I always say to people, figure out where the person you're talking to is coming from. Perhaps ask them why they've asked that question. Next thing I always like to press into is this. You're absolutely right. Christians have to answer that question. If there's a good God, why is there suffering in the world? We forget, though, that our atheist friends have to answer that question too. And the question they, of course, have to answer is, number one, why does suffering feel so wrong? If there is no God, and we live in a universe with just atoms and particles in motion, then at the end of the day, people are going to suffer. That's just how the universe is designed, if you like. Evolution proceeds by the weak suffering and the strong surviving. So actually, suffering we should celebrate, right? I mean, when we had the COVID pandemic, there's the COVID virus spinning out the herd and ensuring humanity is genetically a little bit stronger. But that's not how we respond. I don't know any of my skeptical friends who go, suffering is just the way the world is. In fact, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's just nature thinning out the weak. We instinctively rail against it. We instinctively shout against it. We instinctively ask why. When we're at a funeral, death instinctively feels wrong. So I want to begin by asking my secular friends, where do all those instincts come from? Because they make sense on the Christian view of reality, that suffering is not right, that something has gone wrong with the world. And then the question is, what's gone wrong? And if there's a God, what has God done about it? So I'd want to press some questions into my skeptical friends first. Then I'd want to come over Clayton's the Christian answer here and say, look, I think every worldview has to answer the question of suffering. And the question is, who's got a knockdown answer, but whose answer is the most compelling? And Christianity says, yes, there is a good God who created the world. God gave us some gifts, one of which is freedom. And human beings have abused that freedom in all kinds of ways, which, by the way, is an explanation for a huge amount of suffering in the world. But the Christian answer also says God hasn't just sat there up in heaven, looked down at our suffering and gone, yeah, suck it up, but has actually in Jesus done something about it. And as Christians, we believe that suffering is not the final answer, is not the last word. The world does not end in suffering and pain and injustice, but actually it is going to end with everything that is sad and unjust and unfair coming undone, ultimately, when God wraps up history. Now, we live between where we are now and that end of time. So, yes, there are some tensions and there are some questions. Christians are people who have to live with the reality of suffering, but we can also live with the hope that God has done something about it, demonstrated by what he's done in Jesus. So I would bring all of those things into the discussion, but help our friends see they've got some questions to ask themselves, and I don't think there are knockdown answers here. I think it's asking the question, who has the most compelling answer when it comes to suffering, even if there are still some questions.
Dr. Andy Bannister is our guest. He's the Director of Solas and also author of this book, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. We're going to be back with Andy in a couple of minutes' time. He also has done some extensive studies, in fact, holds a PhD in Islamic studies. So we're going to talk more about the interfaith conversations and how they should be had as well on the way next here on Towards Understanding.
The following views are not necessarily endorsed by this radio station.
This federal election, make an informed choice by knowing where political parties and candidates stand on the issues that shape our nation when you go to australiavotes.org.au. It cuts through political spin with a clear Christian values-based comparison of party policies and responses on issues affecting you and your community. Make your vote count by being informed and prepared at australiavotes.org.au. Thanks to the Australian Christian Lobby.
Authorised by M. Pearce for the Australian Christian Lobby Canberra. Program sponsor.
My guest is Dr. Andy Bannister. He's the Director of Solas, which is an evangelism and training organisation over in the UK. He's also author of the book, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, a panic-free guide to having natural conversations about your faith. And we have been talking about many parts of that book and the conversations around that. I suppose one other aspect around this too, Andy, is when somebody's actually, and we've sort of talked so far really about sort of people maybe being slightly interested in it. But when somebody says, I really want to get a bit deeper into this and some more understandings with that, at times maybe we don't have those next answers. What's the best way to actually help people when they're saying, look, I actually want to commit to this relationship, I want to understand more? What's the best steps that you suggest that somebody takes?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting. Since the idiot book, as my daughter affectionately puts it, that we've been talking about, came out, myself and some friends wrote another book that came out about Easter time last year, which is almost a follow-up book called Have You Ever Wondered? And folks can find that online. And that's a book designed to give to people who are thinking about faith, to help them sort of join some of the dots and begin thinking more deeply. And the last chapter in that actually is the very question that you've talked about. Okay, I'm intrigued, I've heard some things, I'm not ready to jump in with both feet yet, but I'd like to go a little bit further. And I always say to folks like that, the people like that listening to the show, I always begin suggesting some things like this. I think first thing I'd recommend is if you've got a Christian friend who you've had some conversations with, ask them a bit about their beliefs. Be direct. Say, okay, I want to explore Jesus a bit more. I know you're a Christian. What is that all about? Tell me how that looks for you and what that means. Because nothing quite beats talking to somebody. If you've got a Christian friend, or even if you haven't, give church a go. A lot of the stereotypes about church are just that. Most local churches are brilliant places of people in different stages of their faith journey. And you can't beat actually coming along and hanging out with others. And so perhaps, for example, the church my wife and I attend on a Sunday, we've got a massive community of people who are not yet Christians, but they're coming, they're welcome. It's a place where questions are welcome. And it's great to be able to engage with those folks. So give church a go. Thirdly, I'd say give the Bible a go. And the best place to start with, I would say, would be one of those 4, first century eyewitness accounts of Jesus we have in the New Testament. We know those as the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark is a great one to start with, quite short. You can read that, over a few hours, or if you're more of a listener, there are audiobook versions of that. Kind of dig in to that, because you can't beat taking a look at the life of Jesus. And as you do, be asking yourself, okay, who is this guy? What's he claiming? Do his claims stand up? Fourthly, I'd say try praying. If there is a God and you try a prayer like, look, God, I don't really know what I think about you, but I want to know. Would you show me? Many people I know who've prayed that kind of so-called seeker's prayer, Clayton, where you just open yourself up to God and go, look, I want to know what is true. It's often amazing the way that God, in my experience, answers that. And then lastly, a lot of churches these days run great courses to help you explore and discover the Christian faith. Perhaps the famous one is called Alpha, which is the worldwide project now, which is a kind of short, I think it's about an 8 or 9 week course. Many churches offer, kind of free food. You come along, bring your questions, hang out with others, and, see if anywhere locally to you listening to this have something like that going on. And again, that gets you into the journey. And all of those things join up. The linking theme behind all of them is do something. We're very good, I think, in today's age, just kind of, sort of, I must think about faith while I haven't got the time. Well, make the time. Do something about it. Whether it's read, listen, watch, talk, or head along to church.
Andy, what I love is that you've certainly got a whole lot of material for people to engage with. AndyBannister.net, and you can find a whole lot of articles and videos, and you have conversations. You're doing a whole lot of various things. They're bite-sized chunks, they're books, they're conversations which help people in all these ways. One other thing that you have is a PhD in Islamic studies, and I suppose I want to dig into that a little bit more, and then also some cross-religious conversations and how best to have that. Maybe the first question with that is, you indicated you've been following Jesus and living that Christian life for quite a while. So why do a PhD in Islamic studies in the first place? What was the reason for you?
Yeah, that's a question I asked myself a lot of the time, actually. So where that started, Clayton, is in my late 20s. I started going up to a place in London, in England, called Speaker's Corner. It's part of one of our big parks there in London. And it's sort of known in some ways affectionately as the World Centre of Free Speech. Particularly on a Sunday afternoon, you can go to Speaker's Corner and you can put a ladder up or a box and you can stand up and you can talk about anything, religion, politics, sport, philosophy, and you'll get a crowd because hundreds, sometimes even thousands of people go there to hear the speakers. And I had a friend who was going along there because he discovered there were lots of Muslims at Speaker's Corner going to preach Islam. And he thought, actually, maybe Christians ought to go and engage with the Muslims. So I got drawn into that. and had some fascinating conversations, actually some challenging conversations, thoughtful conversations. And over 5 years of going most Sunday afternoons to Speaker's Corner in London, I just fell in love with engaging with Muslims. I found them fascinating people who believe passionately, just very differently to me. And I also began to discover, a bit more confidence, which I needed back then, in talking about what I believe. Speaker's Corner was quite a safe place to explore that. But one thing led to another. I hadn't been to university at this point. I was 28. So I signed up and did a theology and philosophy degree, picked an institution here in the UK that had a Department of Islamic Studies. It was a Christian college, but actually had a Department of Islamic Studies run by a former missionary, in fact, an Australian, actually, and a friend of mine now called Peter Riddell, who's now in Sydney. And so I did the undergrad, and then Peter sort of said to me, well, you've got an aptitude for this, mate. You ought to carry on. And sort of I did. I just kind of kept going and ended up with a PhD in Islamic studies, looking particularly at the origins and the formation of the Quran. And so I actually have academic links to Melbourne School of Theology in your city because of that study.
It's fascinating, and I love that it started from an interest in people and where they were at, and that belief. I love that. What a great heart behind that too. Could you talk to us a bit about that too? Because I think there's perhaps people from all different faith perspectives, and obviously being a Christian radio station, we tend to focus from that Christian perspective, but we see a lot of different understandings of faith through the media rather than maybe necessarily in conversations. What is the best way to actually have different conversations with somebody of a different religion?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think the media often, in one sense, it's a bit like shooting fish in a barrel. It's an easy thing to blame the media, but it doesn't help because the media, particularly social media, tends to try and reduce things to sound bites. And so that can give you all kinds of weird perspectives. So as you say, the best way to talk to someone from a different background, whether, by the way, you're listening to this and you would say, well, I don't have a faith, great. When you talk to someone who does, or if you're a Christian listening to this and you've got a friend, a neighbour, a work colleague who's perhaps a different faith, a really great starting point is to find the opportunity, Clayton, to sit down over a coffee or a sandwich or something and take the time to find out a bit more about them. And actually, in the How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot book, I share 4 questions kind of there, which are really good for those kind of, as want of a better word, interfaith conversations. You can ask your friend, hey, do you believe in God? And if so, what do you think God is like? What do you think human beings are? What do you think has gone wrong with the world? And what do you think the solution is? And those are 4 really good questions you can use if you're, say, a Christian, to give you an example just for that, talking to a Muslim, because you'll discover there are some things we have in common with our Muslim friends and also some huge differences because they believe very different things about all 4 of those categories. But rather than kind of leap in and say, well, you're a Muslim, I think you're wrong for these 10 reasons, start by taking an interest in what they believe. And for Christians listening to this, if you want a biblical precedent for that, in Acts chapter 17, it's a wonderful story of the Apostle Paul back there in the first century in Athens. We're told he wanders around the city, he looks at all the temples and the idols and the statues, and then there's one particular idol he comes across, one particular altar he comes across, and he uses that to build a bridge to a conversation about Jesus. But he starts by taking an interest. And that's where I think it begins. Take an interest, ask good questions, find out what your friends believe, and then that gives you a wonderful opportunity to say, this is really interesting. In this case, I'm a Christian, so some of the things you've shared we would have in common, but we also have some big differences. And because I've listened to my Muslim friend ask them questions, they are far more likely to listen to me talk about those differences than if I simply leapt in immediately and said, right, I'm not interested in hearing from you. Let me tell you my truth.
Yeah. Could you just say those 4 questions again? Maybe as somebody heard them at the first time, they're like, right, okay, I want to sort of embed those into my memory.
Yeah, absolutely. But the four questions are, Clayton, they are, do you believe in God? And if so, what do you think God is like? And by the way, if you're talking to a secular friend and they say, I don't believe in God, you can still say, well, tell me about the God that you don't believe in. When you hear the word God, what do you think? Because many of our atheist friends have quite interesting sort of views about God, but as Christians we might disagree with. So what do you think God is like? Second question, what do you think human beings are? Are we just atoms and particles? Are we more than that? So what do you think humans are? Question number 3, what do you think has gone wrong with the world? Everybody thinks something has gone wrong with the world. So, find out what your friend thinks the problem is. And then fourthly, what do you think the solution is? And by the way, I hope for Christians listening to this, as you hear those 4 questions, some of you are thinking, oh gosh, I could see how I could talk about Jesus really well using that framework. Because, who is God? Well, Jesus came to show us what God is like. Who are human beings? Well, we're not just atoms and particles as Christians. We are so much more than that. What's gone wrong with the world? Well, obviously the mess that we as human beings have made of it, and the fact we're separated from that God who desires a relationship with us, who wants us as sons and daughters. And then fourthly, what's the solution? Well, again, Jesus stands at the heart of that, God's plan to offer us forgiveness and reconciliation and welcome back into his family. So there's 4 great questions for talking with your friends, and as Christians, you can use those questions to talk about the gospel, the message of Jesus, really clearly.
Andy, part of what you've done is, certainly I know some of the videos and the things that you've done is talk about some of those hot button topics of the day. And it's certainly helpful to have various aspects that, and interviews and conversations that you've done like that to understand. I think that's perhaps also one of those ones that maybe people who are sort of going through life say, well, I follow this faith, but I don't really know how to answer all the questions about the gender topics that people talk about, or about the whatever this might be, and that sort of thing.
Yes.
For those perhaps, again, those pricklier topics or some of those ones to do, how best should somebody who has a faith go about sort of looking and researching and listening to people? How do you find the right people to listen to?
Yeah, that's a really good question right away, and particularly on some of those hot button topics, as we can be afraid, particularly as Christians, even my secular friends sometimes afraid of stepping on landmines. So the first thing I would do is you want to try and in some cases find the expert. So a good example would be the gender question. That's not my area of specialty. Islam is my area of specialty, so it's been helpful to me to find voices that I can trust. I think one way of doing that is find, particularly for Christians, try and find Christian websites that do a really good job at sort of gatekeeping and introducing you to other voices. So at the risk of a shameless plug, you've got Solas. If you were to go to the Solas website and type in any hot button topic into the search bar there, you will find interviews, conversations, book reviews, probably dealing with that topic. And we've tried to find the helpful voices, the thoughtful voices, the compassionate voices, but people who also are doing that within the framework of Christian faith. So you can use a gatekeeper like that. Or in Australia, of course, you've got a wonderful resource. You've got the Centre for Public Christianity. You've got the CPX guys with people like John Dixon, Simon Smart, and others associated with that. They do similar. Lots of really good interviews with people who are experts in those areas. So I would really encourage you, if you're a Christian listening to this, I don't know where to start. Don't feel you have to know everything, but if you can know where to go, it can help. And then, by the way, if you're talking to a work colleague or a friend, and a tough issue comes up, like, say, transgender, for example, which you mentioned, Clayton, rather than feel you need to know the answer, you can simply go, do you know what, that's a really good question. I don't immediately have the answer to it because I don't know everything. But if that question really matters to you, you can say to your friend, would you leave it with me? And I'll do my very best to find you the answer. And then, be true to your word. Do a little bit of research. I've mentioned a couple of resources there. Or, talk to your pastor or an older, wiser Christian that you respect and say, hey, I've been asked this question by a friend. I really want to give them a thoughtful answer. What would you recommend? Because what I would say is, no matter what the tough question is, Clayton, there are brilliant Christian women and men working in those areas, whether it's transgender, artificial intelligence, climate change, whatever it is. There are brilliant people out there who will help you if a friend's got that as an issue. It might take you a little bit of work to get there, but it's worth doing that work if that then takes that your friend that you're talking to that step closer to Jesus.
Love that. That was Solas, Solas is what that is, to look up that, or the Centre for Public Christianity, a couple that Andy mentioned there as well. Andy, thank you so much for writing a book like this, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, for the work that you are doing as well, for the open and honest and the encouragement that you have for all of us, wherever we might be, to have conversations about the things that really matter to us. And of course, if we are somebody of a Christian faith, then obviously that relationship with Jesus is one of the absolute, if not, well, is the absolute core part of who we are as well. So thank you so much for the encouragement. Thank you for taking the time to chatting to us on Towards Understanding.
It's been a joy and a pleasure, Clayton. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Dr. Andy Bannister here on Towards Understanding.
The following views are not necessarily endorsed by this radio station.
We're speaking with Michelle Pearce, CEO of the Australian Christian Lobby. Firstly, Michelle, what is the Australian Christian Lobby?
It's a political lobby group. We lobby politicians on issues that Christians are concerned about across the nation. We have influence on public policy, and also we educate Christians around the nation as to what the key issues are and enable them to campaign alongside us.
Now, you've created a website, australiavotes.org.au. How should people use it?
AustraliaVotes.org.au is a website where we have compared all of the policies of the major parties on issues of concern to Christians, and also allowed candidates to respond to a question that we've put to them so Christians can compare the positions of the parties and also see the values of their candidates.
How have you chosen the policy questions addressed on the website?
There are a broad range of issues that Christians are concerned about. We couldn't ask parties 100 questions, so we had to condense it to those that we really believe are pertinent to our nation at this very moment. So I think that Christians who come from many different perspectives will be able to appreciate the answers that are given on the website.
And finally, Michelle, what would be your encouragement to Christians as the election draws closer?
Go onto the website australiavotes.org.au and be informed. If all Christians are well informed and if we all vote according to truth, then we can have a significant impact on the outcome of the election.
Authorised by M. Pearce for the Australian Christian Lobby Canberra, station sponsor.